Russia's strategy really is to win by not losing.
Yes.
I think in many respects now the most of the winter's through, that Russia is arguably going to find it very difficult to achieve even that. I mean,
Ask you first about the meeting between President Xi and Vladimir Putin in Moscow over today and tomorrow. I mean, it would be unrealistic to imagine that these two leaders are going to speak with perfect frankness to each other, let alone the wider world. But what would you imagine is going to be the outcome of that meeting?
well, I heard what John Bolton said, and I broadly agree with him. I don't think we should expect too much from it, but I also wouldn't want to be too skeptical. All wars end ultimately through negotiations and through diplomacy. And I think the fact that China has not come out full-bloodedly in support of President Putin and Russia is significant, and that we obviously now need to try and find out what he is actually saying and what they're negotiating over, but that we shouldn't dismiss it altogether. I remember saying to you last time I think we spoke that Russia's strategy really is to win by not losing.
Yes.
I think in many respects now the most of the winter's through, that Russia is arguably going to find it very difficult to achieve even that. I mean, we all know in many respects she has failed, and therefore I think we'll be looking for some sort of compromise. And it could be that President Xi's diplomatic efforts might help in that direction.
Yes, there must be a worry. I think there is a worry that it suits China to have this war drag on, and in that way allow and encourage war weariness to set in NATO and among the Western allies of Ukraine against the day that China makes some kind of a move on Taiwan.
Yes, but militarily, I think it is such a much harder nut to crack, Taiwan. One day, China may have the conventional military means. I'm thinking in particular of sort of amphibious capability sufficient to have a reasonable chance of achieving its goal. But that certainly is some way off. I mean, one never knows, but I think most experts are talking about well into the 30s, if not later. Yes. There are other ways, obviously, of disrupting Taiwan and making life there very difficult, short of a physical occupation. But I think it's the latter that we're really looking at. So I'm not convinced that the instability and risks that come out of a long drawn-out war in Ukraine is quite so much in China's interests, as some commentators are saying.
Yeah, I mean, you heard my conversation with John Bolton a short while ago. Can you get your views on the same subject on this, the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq? I mean, John Bolton's position was interesting and clear. He argued mistakes were made after the invasion, among them the dismantling of the governance mechanism in Iraq. Other mistakes too. He did not regret the invasion itself. Lord Richards, what are the regrets in your mind arising from that invasion and that war?
Well, I mean, John Bolton, I think, would say that, wouldn't he? My own view is that with some benefit of hindsight, although even within the military, but I was quite junior at the time as a major general, we had severe misgivings about it, perhaps because we knew how hollow the follow-up plans were. So I think on reflection, but in all humility too, I think it was an error strategically, and that there are other ways of achieving one's strategic goals without recourse to war. And this Iraq was an example.
In as far as it's possible to transport yourself back in time to what was known then, I mean, knowing what we know now, you argue that it was a strategic error. Do you think you'd have argued that at the time? Would you have seen it that way had you been in those councils at that early stage?
Gosh, good question. I mean, I was I was a major general, and I was representing the chief of the general staff at the Chiefs of Staff Committee, and I can tell you that there was a pretty spirited discussion about whether or not this was a good thing to do, both at the strategic and, if you like, ethical level. And a very courageous Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Boyce, did insist on Tony Blair being required to prove through his Attorney General that it was legal.
Yes.
So there were big debates amongst the military and obviously amongst the diplomatic community, and indeed Tony Blair himself wanted to go on a bit longer with diplomacy. So I think I was in that camp, and I only wish that we'd won.
Interesting. And just to fast forward a little, you became a senior commander in Afghanistan, across NATO. And you'll see now that there was reporting over the weekend of how those who helped British forces in Afghanistan, interpreters and so on, were told by the Ministry of Defence if they wanted to come to this country, they needed to have their documentation approved by the Taliban to declare their intention to leave to the Taliban, which would have been very obviously dangerous, possibly suicidal. The MOD, as it seems, relented under media pressure. But what do you make about that? What does that, Lord Richards, say about the government and the MOD's handling of this?
Well, I've been a big critic of it for really since we came out so disastrously from Afghanistan a couple of years ago. I and other senior officers have been battling on behalf of the Afghans, on whom we were totally dependent, by the way, for our operational success at the tactical level, and we owe them a huge amount, and their families. I must say, though, when I heard that, I could hardly believe it, because we have been saying to ministers, and including Ben Wallace, who, by the way, I think tears what hair he's got left out over it, to be fair. But we have been saying that this is just not acceptable. And a lot of it is bureaucratic muddle and poor leadership at certain levels. But that did sort of hit the very bottom of the pit, if you like, when I heard that comment about them being required to get permission from the very people who we're trying to rescue them from. It was bizarre, but more importantly, extremely dangerous for those we're trying to help.
I mean, you express yourself really strongly, so I must ask you this: when it comes to the small boats across the channel, some of those in those boats are Afghans, aren't they? Do you believe that those people, in the light of what we know now, in the light of what it's required of them in the future under the government's plans, are these people being betrayed?
Well, I have been asked this before by one of your colleagues. I don't know the answer. Maybe the government ought to be asked that very question. I mean, we are talking through the Arab scheme, which the MOD runs,
yes,
and it has been successful in many respects. But we're now, funnily enough, caught out in part by the sheer number of immigrants coming into this country across the channel, because our Afghan allies are often just not able to be housed, for example. So that's put a block on any further application. So there's bureaucratic stuff like that is making it harder. But I can't tell you for certain that people on whom the British Armed Forces were dependent during our many years in Afghanistan are in that number coming across the channel. If they are, I think we ought to try and find out, and they should be obviously allowed to stay and fast-tracked in. But more importantly, we need to sort out the Arab scheme.
Okay, General Lord Richards, great to talk to you. Thank you for coming into our briefing room on Drive today.
Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.